So a quick note before we start. Has anyone heard of a nappuccino? Pastor, was that from you? All right, well, Emily told me about this concept when she started working the night shift. And it was, apparently the other night shift nurses found out that you can take like a double or a triple shot espresso right before you take a 20-minute nap. And then when you wake up, then you're just ready for the night shift. So, and she told me about this concept like 3 or 4 times, and every time it was like the first time I'd heard about it. So now that's our joke. She's like, hey, Corey, have you heard about this thing called a nappuccino? I was like, no, what's that? So last night I had to have a nappuccino before I prepared this sermon. And I did not have a nappuccino before coming up here, and I could use one, so bear with me. All right, well, glad to be here on a Wednesday night. Thank you, everyone, for making it out here. In case you weren't already aware, our church has a pretty strong relationship with Coffee Oasis. That's an organization that I volunteer with, and they minister for homeless and at-risk youth. I'm there every 4th Friday, so I'll be there this Friday. And essentially, Friday nights are Oasis Center, where we're just spending time with the youth members, building relationships, and we're trying to direct them towards God. I usually give a 5-minute evangelistic talk where I present the gospel, and I've got to say, of all the ministries where I have the opportunity to preach, that is the hardest environment to preach in. The audience is pretty hostile towards Christians. It's not like preaching here where you know most of the audience is going to be a believer. So the director kind of helps out by holding a raffle, and if they pass out tickets to everybody, and if they stick around for the entire time, then he'll draw their names, and whoever's ticket he draws gets a free drink. Just a little incentive for them to stay. But many of them leave before that point, and when they know the talk's about to happen, and the ones who don't usually aren't paying attention anyway. They'll be playing on their phones, or they'll continue talking to their friends. And once I notice that, then it gets in my head. I start getting self-conscious about how I'm sounding. It's like, am I keeping their attention? And it's also difficult because you're supposed to limit it to like 5 minutes, and it's always supposed to dovetail into a gospel presentation. So no matter what topic you start out with, you've always got to like work it back into, and that's why you got to believe on Jesus. And sometimes it's an awkward transition. So it might sound like 5 minutes talk isn't that hard, but it is pretty hard. But I've been doing that on and off for about 7 years now. I volunteered at the Oasis Center in Bremerton before I was leading youth group here. And then I returned to it afterwards, but now I volunteer at the Port Orchard one. And in all that time, there have been 0 times when somebody responded positively after I gave one of those talks. And by that I mean nobody ever followed up with questions that were like honest and seeking God. And of course nobody made any professions of salvation. So with conditions like that, it's hard for me not to become a little cynical, like leading up to having to prepare one of those talks. I mean, I still know it's important, but you kind of get this defeatist attitude, as though the best you can hope for is just to deliver a half-decent talk, and then maybe they'll sit patiently and respectfully. But you sometimes don't really believe that it's actually accomplishing anything. So anyway, on one of my scheduled service days, I was having a really bad week. And I don't mean just like a bad week because I had a hard week at work, but I was having a bit of a spiritual crisis, and I was doubting that I had any ability to influence anybody spiritually. And it was so bad that I just wasn't feeling spiritual enough to prepare a talk that week. And I ended up messaging the director and said, I'm sorry, my head's not in the game today. Is it okay if I just don't have a talk prepared? And he said, yeah, it's okay, just come and hang out with the youth members anyway. There's a lot of value in that. And of course, it was too late to have anybody else take my spot. And so I felt a little bad, like I was letting him down. But that week, of all weeks, was when one of the kids who regularly attended got saved without me having a talk prepared. that kid was one of a group of about 6 of his friends, and in my head, I referred to these kids as the Sour Patch Kids. I would never say that to their face, but it was just the attitude that they would bring and kind of the fact that they were all scrawny and had bad attitudes, and it was like, yeah, you guys aren't as tough as you look, but... yeah, this kid had a near-death experience earlier that week. He nearly overdosed on drugs. I don't know what it was, but when he showed up that night, he was talking about how he wanted to be close to God, and he had questions about baptism, and he was somebody I had almost written off as a lost cause. But in that moment, it was like God just lifted the burden off my shoulders that I felt like I needed to be the one who was changing his heart. God reminded me that I actually have no power to change somebody's heart, and that's entirely his job. I recognized then that I was doing what he asked me to do just by being faithful in attending and participating in the ministry, being a witness, and being a point of stability in the lives of those kids that Coffee Oasis ministers to. And God was the one that was orchestrating the changes in that young man's life leading up to him getting saved. And he must have been doing the same things, not only in that one young man's life, but in other kids there, and in my life, and in the other volunteers. And it was a really good experience. So of all the lessons that God has had to teach me when I get to a point of spiritual crisis like that, I feel like the one that I've got tonight is... the one God keeps bringing me back to. I feel that same discouragement every time I hear about somebody that I pray about who regresses and then falls back into sin, or somebody who isn't saved, living their life in the world. And I always wonder if God, somehow God is failing to live up to his promise that his word will not return to him void. Or maybe if the problem is with me because I'm not actually saved and don't have the Holy Spirit in me. And that's a really troubling spot to be in. But whenever that happens, God keeps bringing me back to the story of Elijah. And when Elijah had his own crisis of faith. So if you recall, the last time I was here, this would have been November, I was preaching about Elijah then too. We were reading in 1 Kings 17 and 18. So let me just quickly summarize that, because we're going to pick up immediately after I left off with that last sermon. The point with that last one was about how God required something of people before he would perform a miracle. Like in the case of the widow of Zarephath, she had to give the last of her flour and her oil, not because God needed it, but because she had to take a step of faith. And in the case of the people of Israel, in the showdown with the priests of Baal, they had to give the last of their water, and then God provided rain after that. So, let's back up. Israel was under the reign of King Ahab, and it was a new spiritual low for Israel because he had gotten married to Jezebel, and she introduced many pagan practices, brought Baal worship to Israel, infant sacrifice. And Israel itself was following after their king. So Elijah rebukes Ahab for this, and he cursed Israel with a drought that lasted 3 years until Israel was brought to the point of desperation. So God tells Elijah to return and confronts the priests of Baal. They agree to a contest where the true God has to respond by consuming a sacrifice by fire, and the priests of Baal are humiliated before God, and God demonstrates his power by not only consuming the sacrifice with fire, but by having them douse it with water first, like I just mentioned. And it was like God responded in a way that only he could. So faced with that display of God's power, the Israelites make a show of repentance. They fall on their faces, and they declare that Jehovah is the true God. Elijah takes a victory lap then and commands that all the priests of Baal be executed. And then God causes the rain to fall again. Elijah tells Ahab to return to Jezreel in his chariot. And just like a weird cherry on that story, you get that God miraculously empowers Elijah to speed down ahead of Ahab's chariot and beats him to Jezreel. The commentary I was reading said that it was probably so that he could declare that it was actually God that delivered that and not Baal. So I don't know what to make of that, but it sure was interesting. So that's all background for where I want us to pick up tonight. I actually want to highlight what happens immediately after that. We're going to pick up in 1 Kings chapter 19. And let's pick up at verse 1. We'll read verses 1 through 4. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. So what was it that caused such a dramatic reversal in Elijah's behavior here? He had gone from a literal mountaintop experience where it seemed like Israel was on the verge of repentance and national restoration, to now he's hiding in the wilderness, fleeing for his life. Elijah didn't have his Bible with him like we do, because he probably thought that chapter 18 was the end of his story, and that he didn't realize that chapter 19 was coming. So if we were writing his story, that'd probably be right where we would choose to end the story, because that's the way we like it to go. It's a nice, happy ending. Elijah, after this 3-year-long standoff, makes a triumphant return and wins a climatic battle against the idolatry Israel is in captivity to. And that's the literal mountaintop moment where the story should end. But something changes in him when Queen Jezebel's messengers get to Elijah, and they tell him that she's out to kill him. It was like, I'm guessing that it was the moment that the illusion that the war was over shattered for him. I'm very familiar with that feeling, just in my line of work as a programmer, because you can spend sometimes weeks working on a feature, and then when you finally merge it into the rest of the code and make it available for end users, then I get a text, and it's my boss saying, hey, something's broken in prod, can you go take a look? And then your heart just sinks, and it's like, oh man, can't I just be done? Can't I just get the W for this once? And I'm guessing that's where Elijah was at this point in his life. God, I am done. I've got no more fight left in me. So most of what I want to talk about tonight is the conversation that takes place between God and Elijah to get him back into the fight. But we need to recognize that that's not what happens first. It takes a few verses from this point in the same chapter, and I'm tempted to just skip there, but we'd be missing the entire point, because Elijah needed more than just straight talk truth from God to get him back in action. At verse 4, that's the lowest point we ever see Elijah in the Bible. Elijah is described, he wasn't in a place to receive truth at that point, and God knew it. Restoring Elijah was going to be a journey, not a moment. So if you understand that point, then you'll understand everything about this message. Not only was it true for Elijah, but it's true for Israel. Israel was not going to be restored after that one victory. Israel's still not restored to this day. And not only is that true for Israel, but it's true for the people we pray for. I've never seen somebody that I've prayed for be restored to good standing with God just in one moment. Before or after they're saved, it's always a journey. So Elijah needed to unlearn the idea that it was his responsibility to convert Israel and restore them to good standing with God. And God had to teach him that using himself as an example. So God's first act in restoring Elijah was to care for his physical needs. Let's pick up where we left off at verse 5. We'll read down to verse 7. And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, then an angel touched him, and said unto him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a cake baken on the coals, and a cruse of water at his head. And he did eat and drink, and laid him down again. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time, and touched him, and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. 2 times in a row, Elijah eats, drinks, and sleeps. And God knew that's what he needed at that time. It's touching to see that even though God is a spirit and doesn't have the same physical needs we did, I mean, Jesus did, he got to share those, but even in his glorified state, God understands our needs and our limits, and I think it's a misconception to say that God doesn't give you more than you can handle, but he knows just exactly how much you need, and he knows what to give you once you reach your breaking point. I think that God chose to do that to communicate that he was always providing for Elijah. There's some similarity here to how he provided for Jonah. So if you remember in Jonah chapter 4, after all the exciting stuff with the storm and the fish swallowing him and spitting him up on the shores of Nineveh, Jonah goes and delivers the message, and then he camps outside the city, makes a booth, it says, and he waits for God to bring the wrath that's going to destroy the city. And you just think, man, he's really got the wrong attitude here. So to demonstrate that, God gives him a little object lesson. He allows a gourd to grow, and it shades him from the sun. And it said that Jonah was exceedingly glad for the gourd. It's a little tender mercy that God provides him, but it's very short-lived. The gourd, God prepares a worm that eats the gourd, and then it says the sun beat down on Jonah's head, and then he was wrathful, and God asked him, hey, are you in the right place to be, is it right for you to be angry? And then he uses it to bring him to his senses and say, hey, how come you you have compassion for this gourd that you had no part in bringing, and you don't have any compassion for the 120,000 people that live in Nineveh who need somebody to teach them their right hand from their left hand? You see, in Elijah's case, God used an angel to provide for him. God could have done the same thing for Jonah, but he didn't. He just had the gourd there, and then he didn't explain it until after it caused a reaction in Jonah. I think that the angel was necessary for Elijah's case because God wanted to make the point right out the gates that he was the one who was there the whole time. He wanted it to be visible that even though Elijah felt like he was fleeing for his life, he had never really left God's hand. So don't underestimate the importance of providing for people's physical needs too. That is a component of ministry. I mean, it's possible to go too far in either direction, and I feel like some churches focus a little too much on that at the expense of the gospel, but it's definitely scriptural, and it's definitely something that we shouldn't neglect. It says in James chapter 2, verse 15 and 16, if a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? So James was saying there, that was in the chapter about how faith without works is dead. Well, it's not going to save somebody, but sometimes their physical needs are going to be an obstacle to them receiving the gospel, and we have to keep that in mind. Okay. So what I want to focus on was where God was sending him. After his physical needs have been met, God instructs Elijah to go down to Mount Horeb. And there's a few little interesting details. I was tempted to chase some rabbit trails because it takes him 40 days and he travels 200 miles from where he had fled to Mount Horeb. And he does that all just on the meal that the angels had provided for him. And it looks a lot like Jesus' 40 days of trial in the wilderness. But I don't know where to go with that, so I'll just leave that there. But why was God sending him to Mount Horeb? So I had to look this up. Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are the same mountain. Maybe some of you knew that, but I had to confirm it. But that's the place described as the Mount of God. Those are two names for the same place. It's where God appeared to Moses in the burning bush and where he gives the 10 Commandments to Moses. It's the first place that the Israelites go to after they cross the Red Sea. I mean, not directly. There was the business with the manna and the striking the rock. And it's just my speculation, but Elijah is put in a cave for the scene that's coming up there. And I wonder if that's the same cleft of the rock where God put Moses when he passes by him and shows him his glory. Just my speculation. So this place has really significant importance to Israel and its history. Why did God take Moses here? I think before we can understand that, we have to know what was at the heart of Elijah's reason for his depression. After Elijah makes it there, God asks him directly in verse 9, "What doest thou here, Elijah?" In verse 10, Elijah answers, he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." So I see two parts of his reasoning that he gives God. Number one, he says he's jealous for God. He's wondering why God didn't appear, or why God appears not to have delivered the victory that he thought was coming. Elijah assumes that because he didn't see the resolution that he was hoping for, in the timing he was hoping for, that God must not have been working in that moment. And part two of his reason for this spiritual low point is that he feels like he's alone. The way he sees it, he's the last faithful servant of God, where the others have either been killed for their faith or they've fallen into idolatry. He feels like he's making a futile last stand while Israel is continuing to decay spiritually. He said the same thing in the last chapter, in chapter 18:22. He said, even I only remain a prophet of the Lord." And that was during the showdown with the priest of Baal. He had this complex that he's the last stand. And God needed to correct him of both of those assumptions. But he chooses to do that in different ways. So the first thing that God chooses to do to teach him is he has to refute the assumption that the victory wasn't delivered in the timing and in the manner that Elijah was expecting. God chooses to show him something about his nature. So in verse 11, it says, And he said, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice." And so it's significant that we're told that God was not found in all of those powerful displays of force of nature. And if you think about it, it's kind of ironic, because if you look at insurance forms, they'll refer to things like that as acts of God. And yet here we're witnessing acts of God and told explicitly that God's not in them. It's not to say that, God didn't cause them. He did, but that's not where he was working. Where was he found? He was in the still small voice. And the lesson here is that you will fail to recognize where God is working if you're only expecting the big fireworks displays, the spectacular displays of power, when more often he's using the foolish things to confound the wise. It says in 1 Corinthians 1:27, "But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised hath God chosen. Yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence." It's just wired into us that bigger is better, and we have to accumulate more and more power to ourselves if God's going to be in something. And really, that's just our flesh talking. Okay, now the other assumption that Elijah had there was that he was alone, and God has to give him his next assignment to help him unlearn that. So picking it up at verse 15, "And the Lord said unto him, Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay." We'll pause there. God had to show him explicitly what the next generation was going to look like. So it wasn't that he was the last stand and that Israel was in its final days before it collapses and then becomes like the pagan nations around it. God had a plan from the start, and God had a plan for the future, but Elijah just needed to trust him in that. Jehu was appointed as the next king of Israel, which meant that God was looking ahead to a time when Ahab's reign was going to be over. Ahab, to that point, the lowest point in Israel's history. And Elisha was appointed to be Elijah's successor, who would go on to perform twice the number of miracles that Elijah is recorded to have performed. And I'm sure Elijah must have had mixed feelings about that, because it was sort of like God was saying, okay, you think that this is the end of the road for you? Well, you're going to have to train up a man, and he's going to do twice as much as I did with you. And it shows that, these things show that judgment was coming too. So what about Hazael? He was the king of Syria, or he was going to be appointed king of Syria. That was Israel's constant enemy in the book of Kings. The end of the kingdom of Israel would be at the hand of the Syrians during their captivity. And God allowed that as, chastisement for their unfaithfulness. Finally, God gave Elijah some additional information just to drive home that point that Elijah wasn't seeing the whole picture. So right there in verse 18, "Yet have I left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him." So God showed him right there that even at that present moment, before he completes his assignment and appoints the leaders of the next generation, that there's people right there who Elijah didn't even know about, who had resisted the temptation to go along with the crowd and save their lives, perhaps, or fit in with the rest of society and bow the knee to Baal. And Elijah wasn't even aware of that. Now, let's go back to the question, why did God feel like it was necessary to bring Elijah to Mount Horeb to make this point? I mean, why couldn't God just have all of that happen right where he was at? So, like I said, Mount Horeb was right there at the beginning of Israel's birth as a nation, and it was all God's work. God had given Israel his covenant, and he was showing Elijah that he hadn't cast his people aside. Israel's preservation and restoration was not Elijah's responsibility, and he shouldn't have taken that on as his own burden. He just needed to trust in God's faithfulness and obey the call to the ministry that God had given him. So, final point here. In that same way, we need to understand the ministry that God has appointed us to. So in 2 Corinthians 5:18, it's called the ministry of reconciliation, and we're called ambassadors for Christ. God gave us the responsibility of bringing the gospel to the unsaved world, to be witnesses of the work that God has done in us. But the actual responsibility of changing people's hearts, that's in God's lane, and we need to stay out of God's lane and trust that he's going to do the work in people's hearts. So that should be, hopefully, a great encouragement to you next time you're feeling like responsible for somebody who isn't in the place spiritually where you want them to be. It's not going to happen in our timing. It's going to happen in God's timing, and we need to trust him with that. Okay, that's everything I've got tonight. So I appreciate everybody being here. Do we have any announcements, Fred? Pop quiz. All right.
Corey, we have a men's function on the 29th, Friday the 29th.
Men's function.
Game night.
All right.
Next Friday night.